Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 14, New Selection. Vilgax's laughter filled the still air. It was harsh and raucous. "No," Gwen cried out, burying her face in Kevin's chest. She was shaking, tears dripping onto him as her skin heated under his hands. She was trying to keep her powers in check as Ethan fell bonelessly to his knees. Kevin held on to Gwen, closing his eyes as Vilgax crowed in triumph. "I am victorious!" he shouted as his lackey reappeared from the trees. He looked haggard but relieved, even excited. "Fetch me my prize!" Vilgax commanded, and Kevin held on to Gwen tighter, acutely aware of the way her hair was flickering between red and pink. If he wasn't mostly sure he would lose her forever too, he would let her go full Anodite and rip Vilgax to shreds. Ethan was sobbing, his chest heaving as he shook his head. Siphon picked through the shards of stone and crystal that had been chromastone. Kneeling for a moment, he pulled out the Omnitrix symbol that had once sat on Chromastone's chest. He brushed off the dust reverently. "I have it, Master. The Omnitrix is yours. This whole world belongs to you." It was like floating in an ocean of green and black, staring up at an identical sky. She was doing something important. She shouldn't be here. "Vilgax, I have to stop him!" The lights brightened slightly. "Make a new selection." The voice was almost hers, just more metallic, a voice she'd come to know as the voice of the Omnitrix. Huh? Was she inside the Omnitrix again? It didn't feel like the other times that had happened. "The current DNA sample has been rendered temporarily unstable. Please make a new selection." Jen blinked. What that meant for Chromastone, she had no idea. But if she could go back and kick Vilgax's ass, she was going to. It was times like these she really missed Diamond Head. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind than the green lights grew overwhelmingly bright. Siphon bowed as he made to hand the Omnitrix to Vilgax. He hissed in pain as the device grew white-hot in his hand and began to glow bright green. He dropped it and stepped back. The device seemed to have decided that the laws of physics no longer applied to it as it floated glowing in midair. Then it began to spin, and the shards that had been Chromastone rocketed back into it. Siphon had to dive to the ground to avoid being impaled by the flying shards. "No!" Vilgax screamed defiantly, but even he was forced backwards as the intensity of the light and heat grew. Kevin gasped as Gwen held her breath and Ethan stared, hope blossoming in the depths of his eyes. Max blinked the tears from his eyes. "Come on, Jen." She'd pulled off miracle escapes before. Both of his granddaughters had. Maybe. Just maybe. The lights flashed intensely green and left everyone blinking away at the afterimage. A voice echoed out as they scrubbed their irritated eyes. "You are in so much trouble, Vilgax. I've had a lot of practice with this one." The afterimage cleared and revealed a slim, sparkling figure. She was incredibly familiar to Gwen and Kevin, who both let out shouts of delight. She was dressed a little differently than the last time they'd seen her, and she was taller, but there was no mistaking Diamond Head. She smiled, wide emerald eyes sparkling as she fired a volley of Tadenite at Vilgax. His shield shattered, and the wall of Tadenite she threw up deflected his laser blast. She raced up her own construction and fired at him again midair. He growled in frustration as she threw up another wall of Tadenite. He crashed through it, but Jen was a step ahead of him, and fired down on him from her vantage point near the top of her constructed wall. He grunted in pain and fell to one knee as Jen landed and lifted both hands, summoning 3 towering crystals from the ground and sending them flying into Vilgax. Dust rained. When it cleared, the spectators saw Jen as Diamond Head standing over Vilgax, still mostly buried in Tadenite. "Come on, say it," Jen said, her fist pointing at Vilgax, who was battered and bruised. The two stared each other down for a moment. "I yield," Vilgax conceded, and Jen lowered her arm. Max let out a long breath as he stepped out into the arena. By the rules of the Galactic Code of Conduct as ratified by the Casey Kelly Accords, you have lost this duel. You must now leave this world and never attack it again. Do you acknowledge? Max stated as he stepped out onto the battlefield, his hand on his sidearm as Vilgax slowly pulled himself free from the rubble. There was silence for a moment, then Vilgax nodded. I acknowledge. He turned towards Jen, but made no move to attack. But know this, Gen 10. I will have my vengeance upon you. Green lights flashed, and Jen smiled her own grin at him. Yeah, sure, now get the hell off my planet. Siphon tapped a button on his gauntlet after a look from Vilgax, and both of them vanished, taking the shield generator with them. The shield vanished, and Jen looked up, watching as Vilgax's ships vanished. She let out a breath and staggered. Max made it to her first and caught her. She shook her head. I'm okay. She let out a deep breath and pulled her jacket off her shoulder, the same one Vilgax had driven the sword into when he'd shattered Chromastone. She yanked down the collar of her shirt and blinked at the brand new scar decorating her shoulder. I apparently can't get out of a solo fight with him without a scar, but I'll live. The other three raced up to them, and Gwen wrapped her cousin in a hug. Jen returned it and grinned at Ethan over her shoulder. Then she frowned. That really was being broadcast all over the world, huh? Jen asked her grandfather, who nodded. So much for my secret. Max patted her on her uninjured shoulder. Not quite. Cooper managed to scramble the signal. About halfway through, no one saw Jennifer Tennyson. Jen grinned, and Ethan stepped up to her. He pulled the holoviewer out of his pocket. Told you I wouldn't need it. Jen laughed and inched closer to him. He leaned in and kissed her. She grabbed him and deepened the kiss. It took a moment for Gwen to clear her throat and remind the two that they weren't alone. Jen laughed as she released Ethan, who looked a little punch-drunk. What happened to Chromastone? Gwen asked softly. She wanted to know, but she didn't want to pull up a large portion of the reason Jen had taken off the Omnitrix in the first place. Jen shook her head. I don't know. It doesn't feel like last time. Jen never mentioned Feedback's name. Gwen doubted she ever would again. She shook her head down at the Omnitrix. I swear this thing is busted. But the team's still working, right? She held out her hand. Gwen nodded and placed her hand on top of her cousin's. Ethan followed suit. Kevin hesitated. Gwen glared. I was going to. He placed his metal hand on top of the pile, and Max smiled at them. Things were never going to be normal with these teens, but maybe it could be okay. Chapter 15. Old Flames, New Friends. Alan hitched his backpack up a little higher on his shoulder as he and Cooper stepped off the transport, Helen and Manny close behind them. Pierce was the only member of the team who'd decided he wanted to stay on Earth after everything that had happened with Vilgax. His wrist was still healing from a double fracture the Warlord had inflicted, and he insisted someone had to stick around to keep an eye on Max and Jen's team in case they needed backup. Helen secretly thought he was more likely keeping an eye on the blossoming relationship between Jen and Ethan, but she decided to keep her nose out of her brother's love life. They were greeted by two figures. One was a medium-height, scaled being wearing glasses on his long, sharp-toothed face. His smile was warm enough, though. The other was taller, at least 6 foot, furred, and mostly blue with black stripes and a white face. The more fish-like one stepped forward. Lovely to meet y'all. Max's new recruits? They nodded. He smiled wider. I'm Magister Patellidae. I was Max's partner back in the day. He gestured to the cat-like being next to him. This is trainee Rook Blanco. He'll be showing you around the academy. We heard about that recent troubles on Earth. That Vilgax is a nasty piece of work. We understand that your team went up against him before Miss Tennyson could accept the challenge. Alan stepped forward and nodded. We did, sir. It didn't go well. Magister Patellidae nodded. I didn't expect it to have. Not many can go up against him and come out the other side alive, so you didn't do half bad. Manny perked up at that. He'd been silently afraid that they would arrive at the academy with people laughing behind their backs for getting beaten. But just the opposite seemed to be true. The looks they garnered from the others working and moving about the docking bay seemed to be looks of wonder rather than derision. If any of you have any troubles, you come to me or any of the other teachers here. He leaned in conspiratorially. I'll let you in on a little secret. A lot of beings hear Max Tennyson and his grandkids everything, so mention his name and you'll usually find someone willing to help you. He straightened. Now, it won't be a cakewalk, but I think you four will fit in just right. Now, which one of you is Cooper Daniels? Cooper tentatively raised his hand. Magister Patellidae smiled. Lovely. You're with me. Our resident lab boys say you requested a lab position. We've got just the perfect one. Cooper looked at the others a bit nervously and hesitated. The up until then silent Rook Blanco broke in. I apologize for my interruption, but if I may reassure you, the three of you, he pointed to the three males of the group, have been assigned the same dormitory. As such, you will see each other quite frequently. Cooper let out a breath. Thanks, Mr. Blanco. The feline alien shook his head. It is quite all right, although my preferred form of address is simply Rook, if you would not mind. Cooper blushed slightly and nodded, meekly following Patellidae. Rook led the others off, pointing out certain areas like the mess hall and simulation rooms. Alan frowned and cleared his throat. The Magister said you were a trainee. What does that mean? We haven't really gone over ranks and things like that. He was feeling a little out of place. Rook nodded, understandingly. I would assume you had not. I have heard quite a bit about your team and their missions, both in and out of the Null Void in the current events course. He was interrupted as a wolf-like alien raced up to them, grinning wide. Blanco! Are these the newbies? The grin could only be described as wolfish. Rook nodded. That is correct. He introduced them one at a time. This is my dorm mate, Scout, the first Loboan to ever join the Plumbers. The Loboan waved Rook off. Yeah. Is it true you guys know Gen 10? Rook shot a look at his roommate, and the Wolfman shrugged. Come on, Blanco. You think I don't know about the radio show you still listen to? Or the fact that you've got the next 6 episodes of the show they based on her recorded on her holobox? The fur on Rook's face puffed slightly like an angry cat's as the Loboan turned back to the teens, his grin still firmly in place. So come on. A rumor's been going around ever since we heard you guys were coming. Do you? Helen nodded. We do. Manny and I actually met her before we got recruited by her grandfather. Alan met her first, though. Scout beamed. Too spooky. The teens glanced at each other, and Scout seemed to catch their confusion. Sorry, my conversational human isn't as good as it probably should be, but I think the Earth equivalent is cool. He made air quotes around the last word as he threw a furred arm around Alan's shoulder. You have to tell me everything. Helen frowned and turned to Rook. He seems really interested in Jen. She waited for a response, but Rook didn't seem to catch the hint. Why is that? You do not know. Your teammate is quite famous, and she has been since her first defeat of the tyrant Vilgax. She is part of the reason I joined the Plumbers, along with many other students you will find here. The knowledge that someone our age could stand up to a conqueror, and make the universe a better place was unthinkable. He tried to keep a level tone, but the sparkle in his amber eyes gave away his excitement as Scout laughed. You got him started! Yes! Now come on, I'll buy you all a drink. You don't start classes until tomorrow anyway, and you can tell us everything. Before Rook could object, Manny grinned and followed Scout, who still had a hold of Alan. Helen shrugged. Could be fun. Come on. At the very least, I need to keep an eye on Manny, make sure he doesn't pick any fights. Rook gave her a long-suffering look. That I completely understand, Cadet Wheels. Helen laughed, and they followed the others towards the mess hall. Jen was not happy. It had been a rough few days. Most of the Max Force was gone, off to the official Plumber Academy to earn their credentials for real, which left the team on regular patrols again. Yesterday, they'd had to deal with Volcanus, who'd attempted to buy the planet with the Tadenite he'd taken from Kevin's hide. Literally. He'd run into a bit of a hiccup when Jen won the planet in a Conqueror's Challenge. Legally, she owned Earth now, and she wasn't up for selling, so he decided to drop a bomb and claim he hadn't heard that his renovation license had been revoked until after. They'd managed to stop his plan and only get a bit scorched by the explosion Moldywarp. A mole person with a less-than-friendly personality had set off to prevent Volcanus from returning to try again. Today, Max had sent them out to find a missing alien spring breaker at a popcorn festival in a nearby town. That had ended with Jen, as Echo Echo, having to jump down the throat of a rampaging giant badger-like creature, only to be vomited back up, along with the meat that had been forcing the transformation on the poor creature. Ethan stepped over to her, trying not to look completely grossed out as she shuddered, pulling herself out of the sludge and glancing over her shoulder to see if the plan had worked. Luckily, it had, and the alien, Dekka, had returned to normal and was currently being embraced by his friend. Ethan extended a hand and Jen shook her head, trying not to breathe in. "Nope, this is nasty. You got the mayor on lockdown?" He nodded, pointing over to Gwen and Kevin, who were watching over the tied-up man in the white suit. The mayor had kidnapped the poor alien kid because he, when eating popcorn, could produce gold in one of the grossest ways possible. But Jen kept that to herself, as Gwen read him his intergalactic Miranda rights. It turned out they were pretty lucky, and nearby the farm where the aliens had arrived. It didn't take them long to get the aliens on their way home with a threat from them that they were never returning. Jen shook her head. Greed was about to ruin this small town's economy, but that would hold for at least another 17 years. She was busy hosing herself off by the barn, literally. She finished as Gwen pulled Kevin close. She couldn't hear what they were talking about from here, but Kevin looked serious, so it was probably relationship stuff. Jen shuddered again. "I need a shower. Bad." She muttered as she slipped towards the back seat of Kevin's car. There was a plumber transport there to pick up the mayor so he could stand trial for the kidnapping of an alien and endangerment of an entire planet. Ethan was leaning on the back of Kevin's car and grimaced slightly. "Feel better?" Jen shook her head. "No." She left it at that and slipped into the back seat, sitting on several towels that Kevin had pulled out of the trunk. They made their way back to Bellwood with every window in the car rolled down. Jen spent 3 hours scrubbing her skin raw in the contamination showers as Gwen ran her clothes through the wash several times. When she emerged, the others had already gone home, except for Pierce, who was sitting at the main console. He smiled slightly. "Thought you might have drowned yourself in there," he joked. Jen rolled her eyes and frowned at the file in front of him. "I considered it. What are you working on?" He pulled up a few photos from the file. "We got an odd request from a retired Magister Green." Jen nodded. "One of Grandpa's old plumber partners." Pierce nodded. "He's training his granddaughter to be a plumber." Jen raised an eyebrow at that. Last she'd heard from Magister Green, only braves could go on dangerous missions. She'd had to sneak out in her grandfather's pack as gray matter to go after what they had thought had been a werewolf. But of course, if it hadn't been for the 3 girls, Gwen, Kai, and Jen, the 2 old Magisters wouldn't have escaped the alien they'd been hunting. So maybe he'd turned his ideas around after all. She refocused as Pierce continued. "They've been doing a lot of artifact recovery lately, and have had a few run-ins with the Forever Knights, and it looks like they found something out of place in one of their old haunts." The photo Pierce pulled up made Jen frown. It was a tapestry she'd seen before, and she shook her head as she pulled off her necklace and set it down on one of the scanners. She sat down next to Pierce. "Computer, pull up the photo files from my communicator." The computer complied. There weren't a lot of photos there, though there was one she'd shared with Kevin of him and Gwen at Grandpa Max's fishing spot that she'd taken before the accident that had mutated him again. She shook her head as she scrolled through them until she got to the very first photo she'd taken with it. She blew it up and set them side by side. They weren't exact. The one Wes Green had sent looked older and more dusty, almost looked a little more detailed under the dust, but the writing along the bottom was the same. Pierce gave her a questioning look, but she shook her head. "Let me guess. The mystery Magister Green has on his hands is why an old Forever Knight tapestry has Galvan writing along the bottom?" Pierce's eyes widened. "Yeah, how'd you know?" "I ran into this one," she pointed to her photo, "when the knights approached me to help them hunt down a dragon. Turned out the dragon was an alien, so I helped him escape. But the tapestry caught my attention because I was studying written Galvan for non-Galvans at the time." She grabbed a piece of paper and squinted at the writing, scribbling as she did. Then she frowned. "The defeat of the Dagon? That has to be a misspelling." Pierce shrugged. "No idea. I don't read Galvan." Jen shook her head. "Have Grandpa Max take a look at it when he comes in tomorrow morning. Maybe I'm translating it wrong, but message Magister Green back and let him know it's definitely Galvan writing." Pierce nodded and began to type one-handed. Jen frowned at the cast on his wrist. She twiddled the dial on the Omnitrix and slapped it down, transforming into her Apollinite form. Pierce blinked. Nifty. She grinned, teeth sparkling like polished marble. Give me your hand. He frowned, but complied. She laid her hands on his and focused. He winced slightly as his hand grew warm and intensely itchy for a moment. Then the dull, throbbing, ever-present pain vanished and he could flex his fingers again. She grabbed the cast and broke it in two, pulling it off his hand without ever hurting him. He hesitantly moved his wrist back and forth. It was fine, no longer at all painful. Thanks. He smiled and she returned it as green lights flashed and she returned to normal. Least I could do to thank you for looking after Grandpa Max in the null void. Pierce smiled lightly. Oh, he looked after us more than we did him. Jen laughed. I bet he did, but it's good to know he wasn't there alone. Pierce nodded and finished up his message to Magister Green. He hit send and stood, holding out his newly healed hand to her. Come on, I'll buy you a smoothie. As thanks. She nodded and let him help her out of her chair. Before they left, Pierce slipped on an ID mask and his spikes vanished, though little else about his appearance changed. He grinned slightly sheepishly. Careful. Still sharp even though I don't look it. Jen laughed. I know how ID masks work, Pierce. You're fine. They set out to Mr. Smoothies.